Yeah.
took areas that don't usually go together. So today you wanted to talk about literature and politics.
Veteran wanted to talk about that.
Yep.
Yeah.
I figured we talked about current events a little too much, so
It's
let's
a great
shift
subject.
gear.
No, it's a great subject. It'll take me back to likely stories. I was very interested in, for a lot of reasons, to go into your thesis defense. It went on for 2 hours, and the entire 2 hours was spent on methodology. There was virtually no substance whatsoever.
No.
It was remarkable. It really was remarkable. So, when social scientists deal with human beings, there's a tendency to treat flesh and blood individuals as if they're abstract numbers. I mean, we all already knew that, but here I was sitting right next where you're sitting now. That was just remarkable. The whole thing, there was one fellow apparently seemed to be the chief statistician. Who was this young fellow over here?
Dr. Foster.
He's the chief statistician in the group?
He's actually our social scientist, our social psychologist. But yeah, he does a lot of statistics too.
Well, I mean, it was just talking about different ways to deal with statistics. Isn't that amazing? So there is that tendency that when social scientists deal with human beings, it becomes very impersonal. So literature can complement social science by making it more personal, by providing intimate portrayals of concrete personal experiences. I mean, they're dealing with the same subject, but one is impersonal and one is the personal. So you usually don't think of it this way, but it can be a very complementary relationship.
You don't want to tilt it down a little bit.
When you think about political literature, you usually think of somebody who's dealing with a political topic. But that's not what I have in mind. I have somebody who's just talking about human beings, but in the process portraying what social scientists are concluding through statistics. If, for example, you could read a scholarly treatise on the Spanish Civil War and learn an awful lot about it, but if you go to the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, north of Fifth Avenue, and you saw Pablo Picasso's, do you remember the famous painting about the Spanish Civil War?
Guernica.
Yeah. You get a whole different perspective that you could never get. It's the same subject, but it's a whole different perspective. And what was the song that was the centerpiece of your presentation?
The Times They Are Changing by Bob Dylan.
So you could read all these scholarly treatises of what was going on in the 1960s and the Civil Rights Revolution, and learn an awful lot about that. But if you listen for 10 minutes to Blowing in the Wind, you get a much more personal insight into what was going on. Same topic, coming from different perspectives. Two very, very important perspectives. So there were two very famous social scientists who dealt with the effect of change on human beings. Human beings don't like change that much, especially when that change begins interfering with their life, when it becomes seismic, social, political, and economic change. One guy was the name of Emil Durkheim. Have anybody heard of him?
Yeah, I've heard of him
Tell
too.
me, tell me how you heard of him.
I took I think Psychology 101 here like in 2010, and
Am I writing with the right thing here?
No, let me get this.
I'll escape, so they won't.
There you go.
Yeah,
might arrest you for criminal mischief or something.
that's right.
No good lawyer.
He wrote a book called Suicide.
That's
He explained the phenomenon known as anomie. Remember us talking about that?
Yes.
What do you remember about it?
I remember it means being a stranger unto yourself.
Yeah, to someone who's directionless, normless, that just are completely dumbfounded. Their lives were once well defined for them. But I thought so, but now everything's up in the air. You don't know what's up or down, what's east or west. So it's a kind of directionless, but taken to extreme, people can commit suicide. That's what the title of his book. And then there was a guy by the name of Eric Fromm. Have you ever heard of his book, Escape from Freedom?
I've heard of it, but I haven't read it.
Was one of the, in the latest book you wrote, came out a couple of years ago, I think one of those guys talked about him.
Mm-hmm. Well, he also deals with what happens when people experience this radical change over a very short period, a decade or so. And they begin to feel powerless. Things are happening to them and they feel they have no control over them. So he came up with a term called alienation, which is a sense of powerlessness. Brantley remembers that because Marx talked about that too. This sense of powerlessness. Now, why would I be interested in directionlessness and powerlessness in 2017? What do you think? Why is that a particular, these are profound subjects at any time, but why in 2017 are they particularly relevant?
That's how a lot of people feel right now.
And those are the people who voted for Donald Trump?
Sure.
Because we don't have any standards of who do we go for direction.
Well, I mean, look at all the things that have happened that have never happened before. A black man is elected president. A woman is nominated for president. People are losing their jobs to automation and globalization. Immigrants are coming to this country who've never been here before. So the times really are changing again. And people are scared. They're confused, they're angered, they're dumbfounded. What's going to happen to their lives? What's going to happen to their jobs? What's going to happen? Mostly in their status in society. A phenomenon known as status anxiety begins to arise. Are these people going to take my place in society? So they begin searching for a new set of values, a new source of power that they can internalize. They can't find it in themselves because they're so confused, understandably. So what happens next?
Somebody rises up that says,
Well,
I can give you direction.
A wise guy could be a woman who rises up and he provides the values for them. He's not confused. He's not dumbfounded. He's angry like they are. And he claims to be angry for them. He promises to get their jobs back, to send the immigrants home, and basically to return them to that was once the status quo that they enjoyed and felt comfort in. Now, nobody does something for nothing. Tell me your name again.
Lisa,
So what is the payback? What's the payback for getting their jobs back and their status back, and then that won't be confused anymore?
You mean, what do they have to give him?
Yeah,
Security also?
His votes.
complete
Trust.
obeisance to what he wants to do. And of course, this is the beginning of a dictator. And these, what I'm calling a wise guy, the fancy name for that, we've talked about this before, is the demagogue. They just can sense when people are uneasy. And they know exactly what deal can be made. Because this sense of powerlessness and this sense of directionlessness is just too much for people to bear. So people will give up their freedom. Voluntarily, that's the point. He doesn't send troops in to force them to vote. And by the way, this only can happen in a democracy. He buys their votes. And the payback is dictatorship. And people don't care. They feel confident once more. They feel at ease. Their confusion is gone. Their anger is gone. Who could live that way? Now, but this is both rational and irrational. I mean, they have lost their jobs. They have lost their status in society. But who's to blame for that? So that's what these wise guys do. They finger a group. Usually it's a powerless group that can't fight back. It could be Jews, it could be gypsies, it could be Mexicans, it could be African Americans.
Unwed mothers or single moms?
Absolutely. People on welfare.
Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. And he fingers these people and he says, they are the source of your problems. And with your help, we'll get rid of them and you'll return to the comfort you once enjoyed. But nobody does something for nothing. There's a price to be paid, and the price is freedom. And under certain conditions, this radical change, I guess the best way to describe it is seismic change. Political, social, economic. When people's heads are spinning around. When they're in a small boat, they've lost the oars, there's a storm brewing, and there's no rudder to a boat. That's the feeling. In other words, they're being blown around and they have no control over the direction they're going. Yeah.
Do you think otherwise rational people put in situations like that would compromise all of their values that they've never questioned just to, I like this word, status anxiety. I didn't even know that word, but that sort of explains a lot of what I'm saying. And people that I know that I feel like are very good people, very intelligent people.
I think the term is well-meaning. They're
Yeah.
otherwise well-meaning people.
Yes,
Yeah.
I'm seeing them go against things that they believe in for, I don't know, I guess a trade-off of something else.
It happens all the time. I was watching a show. Have you ever seen this show where some actors come on and they do some outrageous things? In this case, they're sitting in a restaurant in Arizona, and somebody who looks like they're Mexican comes and what's the name of that show?
I know the show, and they're recording it, but the other people
Yeah.
don't know. Yes,
Yeah.
I know the show. It's like a social experiment.
Exactly. So it was on last night, and so these two actors say, I don't want you to wait on me. He says, what have I done? He says, well, you're obviously an illegal wetback from Mexico, and you're taking our jobs, and send someone else. Send a real American. He says, what do you mean a real American? My family's been living here for generations. He says, no, you're lying. And all of a sudden, this old man who's sitting at another table comes up and he says to these people, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. And he goes to the owner of the restaurant, who he thinks is the manager or the owner, and he says, throw these people out, they're mistreating your employee. All of a sudden, this guy, Al Quinones, who's Mexican himself, he's the star of the show, comes out of the back kitchen. He says, do you know me? He says, aren't you that TV star? And so he explains what's going on. He says, why did you do what you did? He said, I just couldn't stand it, it's un-American. So Al Quinones says to him, who did you vote for in the last election? He says, I voted for Trump. Now there's exactly what you're talking about. How do you explain that contradiction? That someone on a person-to-person basis would stand up for justice and fairness, but they would elect a guy who clearly was against all of those values. He said, yeah, I voted for Trump, and I'm law and order, and I'm a big Second Amendment guy. And then he lifts his shirt up, and there's this Luger pistol, right? I mean, it was just such an amazing, that's why as soon as you said that, that show I saw last night just came to mind. Isn't that an amazing coincidence? And this otherwise well-meaning fellow voted for Trump. So Al Quinones says, how do you explain that? He said, I have no idea. And that's what happens when you're confused. Somebody comes along who can rile up that confusion for his or her own benefit. And it's not just men. Who's the famous Latin American demagogue? Who?
Ava Braun?
Ava Braun was the girlfriend of Hitler.
Okay, sorry. Evita?
Evita,
I knew it was an E name.
yeah.
I'll get the
She
right
was the
vowel in
wife
there.
of the Argentine dictator. But she became a demagogue herself. Don't you remember the famous play, Don't Cry for Me, Argentina? Yeah. So Durkheim and Fromm deal with these phenomena in social scientific terms. They use figures. And Durkheim shows how, not on a political but a personal basis, people like this, he gives figures on the suicide rates. He goes back to the Enlightenment and the Protestant Reformation, which were times of tremendous change, and he shows how suicide rates went up. It's just very difficult times for people to deal with. This has been, 21st century has been a time of tremendous, tremendous change. I mean, could you, you talk about how this is so contradictory and hard to explain. Who would ever get upset by Barack Obama? I mean, he's the nicest, most... The attack on him is that he was too nice, he was too passive. He wasn't demanding enough. He refused to push people around, which is what you have to do to be a successful president. His goals were wonderful. He just didn't have the, I don't know what it was. I mean, he wanted, because of his own background, we've read his biographies, his autobiographies, he wanted to be a family man. So he said, there was at the end of the political day, I was going to spend that night with my family, because I never had a father that did that. He never had a mother that did that. His mother was traveling around all the time. He had to rely on two white farmers from Kansas to take him. Remember, it was what a remarkable life the guy had. Now, if you want to be a powerful president, that's 24/7. I mean, there really is no family life if you're going to be president of the United States in the 21st century. But I'm just using that as one example. He was just such a nice, easygoing guy. So here you have, so now the presidency is changing hand, and he's standing with his wife, and Trump is standing with his wife. And the headline was, which one of these couples were married 3 times and have an enormous amount of children? Who can get, angry at him. Well, this is it. Hillary Clinton? Oh my God. Compromiser of all compromisers. But what they represented was a change of status. It wasn't them necessarily, but people could read the handwriting on the wall. White males were no longer, it was clear. A sea change is undergoing. People want to try to hold back time. And these demagogues promise that they're able to do it. A high price has to be paid, but they promise they're going to do it. Directionlessness and powerlessness. Any questions so far?
When was that, or who coined that term? I'm just curious, status anxiety? Or
There was a historian, I'm not exactly sure he coined it, but he's the one who popularized it, a famous historian by the name of Richard Hofstadter. And he wrote a book called The Paranoid Style in American Politics. Isn't that a great title?
Yeah, befitting.
And he, in the 20th century, he traces this back to 1964 and Barry Goldwater. He says that really is the beginning of this so-called conservative movement in Republican politics. Now, we mentioned Barry Goldwater in our last talk because the things Barry Goldwater said in 1964 were nuts. Johnson becomes president when Kennedy is assassinated in 1963. So he serves 1 year and then runs for president, and he runs against Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater was just this right-wing crackpot from Arizona. But life sends some curveballs to us, as you'll see in the first place. So he was saying things like we should end the war. If he wasn't saying it, he was intimating that we need to end the war in Vietnam quickly, so we should drop atomic weapons on them. And he would go to places like, in those days, the biggest retirement city in the United States was St. Augustine, Florida. I mean, the average age in St. Augustine in 1964 was people were in their 80s. And he was so right-wing and so out of it that he made a speech to those old-timers that you should do away with Social Security. I mean, that's how ideological this guy was. So, in the face of this kind of craziness, and by the way, he goes on to be, if not the worst presidential candidate in terms of votes, popular votes elected, at least among the top 2 or 3. I mean, he gets no votes whatsoever. Johnson is swept into office again, and that's when he begins to lead the civil rights revolution, kinds of voting rights bills and anti-poverty bills and the war on poverty. And then he brings himself down self-destructively by amping up American presence in Vietnam. The guy who ran against Goldwater because he wanted to do too much in Vietnam all of a sudden becomes the guy who did the most in Vietnam, short of nuclear weapons. At any rate, Goldwater was so crazy in this 1964 campaign that a number of prominent psychiatrists, remember we talked about this, started saying the man is pathologically nuts. don't vote for him. How can you have an authentically insane person in office with his finger on the button? So the American Psychiatric Association got so upset by this for two reasons. Number one, they were psychoanalyzing someone from afar. I mean, this guy wasn't coming into their office. And number two, even if Goldwater was their private patient, a doctor can't share with other people what goes on, right, in the examining room. So the American Psychiatric Association came up with what they called the Goldwater Rule, that from now on we don't want professional psychiatrists commenting on politics. They said it's unprofessional for the reasons they mentioned. Now, why has this become relevant once again? Because psychiatrists are now saying Trump is crazy, which he is. I mean, he makes Goldwater look like the sanest of all people. It got so bad, we were sharing this last time, that a group of psychiatrists at Yale wrote a long letter to the New York Times about how Trump is displaying the classic symptoms of narcissism and how dangerous that is for politics. Green, you told us why.
Because the narcissistic person in power will make decisions based on what they think is going to get them the most applause, rather than...
Or they get angry at the Prime Minister of Germany because she didn't shake his hand properly, and now all of a sudden we go out of NATO. Everything becomes personalized. Instead of worrying about 300-odd million Americans, right? And billions of people around the world, because every decision Americans make affect the whole world. All of a sudden, they're internalizing everything, and that's the problem with a narcissist in particular, but especially. So he really is a narcissist, and he really is dangerous. But when this group of psychiatrists from Yale wrote a letter, they came up with the American Psychiatric Association, hearkening back to 1964, got the psychiatrist from Duke who came up with the contemporary definition of narcissism. So they get him. It's clear he's working for the big boys. They get him to write another letter condemning the psychiatrist who wrote this letter, saying that you violated our rule. And what was the famous line he gave? He said, Trump isn't crazy. As a matter of fact, he gives crazy people a bad name. That was such a great line. Remember, we read that. Your friend in the psychology department read that from the New York Times. His name was Francis. But they got the guy who came up with the definition because they wanted to make sure that what went on in 1964 wouldn't happen again. The people who wrote the letter, the original letter to the New York Times, said, of course we're aware of our association's Goldwater Rule, but sometimes citizenship, and they said, trumps professional standards. He said, we're at a time, as Green explained, where the future of the whole world is depending on a very dangerous person.